Good evening, everyone, and welcome to Critica NYC, a show about the work, life, and politics of the Latinx community in New York City and beyond. I'm your host, Raquel Batista, and today we have an exciting show. The title of today's show is The State of Our Barrios. And I entitled it that way because today is also the State of the Union. We will be hearing later on tonight. Many of us will be looking at the TV, watching to hear what President Joe Biden will be reporting back to the nation, talking about our national issues, what's happening internationally, from talking about issues from voting rights to immigration to the war that's happening with Russia against the Ukraine, and all the other issues that are impacting not only Americans, but the world. And so, we always take this time to reflect on the issues that are impacting the Latinx community here in New York City and across the United States. Today's topic that we have two speakers today, which I will be introducing in a little while. We'll be talking about the issue of voting rights and really looking at what states are doing to improve systems in order to protect the rights of voters, and in particular in protecting the voting rights of Latinos and making sure that we have language access. So we will be talking about that in a bit. But before we get started and I introduce you to our speakers, I did want to take a moment for us to remember one of our heroes in our community that recently passed away. His name is Radames Rivera, and he was a person very involved within the labor rights movement, was a leader at 1199 SEIU. He retired several years ago to Puerto Rico, where he continued doing his work, working on issues of civil rights, worker rights, immigrant rights. He was of a Dominican background, but very affiliated with the Puerto Rican community, and worked also on issues on the independence of Puerto Rico. And he recently passed. Many of us here in New York City are very sad to hear of his passing. And so just wanted to hold the space for us to recognize all that Radames Rivera meant to so many of us here in New York City. So we want to thank him, and may he rest in peace. And we, as we continue talking about, the many issues that are impacting us, our governor, Hochul, just recently announced that there will be changes in our masking mandates, including in our schools. And so many of us, such as myself, I have daughters. Many of you have seen in the past. She's 8 years old. She attends New York City public schools, is fully vaccinated. We have also started having conversations around what will this mean as the masking mandates change, and whether or not what she feels comfortable with. Is she going to continue wearing her mask? Will she not wear it? I mean, I can imagine, right, all the parents out there wondering and questioning what's going to happen over the next week and a half with this issue. Some people are worried. Some people are really excited to get the mask off their face. But you know, this is an issue, right, that continues evolving. People, you know, bring up questions around. Just a few weeks ago, we were talking about improving the type of masks that we needed to wear because of the Omicron variant. And now that the numbers have been declining, and we're going into the spring, you know, the aspect of no longer having to wear our mask. And so I say, you know, we just keep our wits about us, right? And make sure that we are involved in our local schools. Make sure you're involved with your school leadership team, your parent teacher association, that you're having conversations with your kids and with their teachers, just to make sure that you get to do the right thing that you feel will work for you and your family. Um, and then, you know, in other news, recently there has been several protests around three of the mayoral appointments by our new mayor in New York City, Mayor Eric Adams, where he has appointed three individuals that are affiliated with their churches. One is Fernando Cabrera, the second is Eric Salgado, and the third is Guilford Monroe's, all who in the past have discussed their views around the LGBT community and same-sex marriage. Several groups came out last week protesting the appointment of these three individuals. And there has been a lot of conversation, especially within the Latino community, right? And on these appointments, two of the appointments are Latino, to both of them from Puerto Rico, Eric Salgado and Fernando Cabrera. And, you know, this is an issue, I think, that, you know, it's always a bit difficult, right? When we're in public service, making sure that the people that are working in public service know and understand that New York City is here for everyone, and that we are not to discriminate against anyone because of, right, their sex, race, national origin, gender. And the LGBT community has raised several concerns around statements that many of that have been made by these three mayoral appointees. And they have stated that they have evolved since making the statements against the LGBTQ community and on same-sex marriage. Mayor Adams also came out defending his appointment, saying that he voted for same-sex marriage in New York State. However, I think that, you know, our communities need more than that they have just evolved. And we wait to see what else they will be demonstrating to us to make sure that no community is locked out from city services, that all communities are heard, that they're being brought to the table, and that we will be able to be working with all of our communities, especially the most vulnerable, especially those that are on the margins, which really look towards the city in order to be able to get city services. So it's something that we here at Critica will keep our eyes on to see how this evolves over time, and how these issues that the community has brought forth will be addressed. So I also wanted to recognize that since today is Tuesday, March 1st, it is Women's History Month. So we will be celebrating all month long all the contributions that women have made in the history of the world, in our role, in our leadership, and all that we bring to the table as women. And so I just want to wish every woman that's watching here and everyone that's life has been impacted by a woman a happy Women's History Month. So thank you very much. So now we'll get started with our invitees that we have today, our two guests who will be discussing the introduction of the John Lewis Voting Rights Act in New York State. We have with us today Orlando Ovalles, who is the Northeast Director of Civic Engagement for NALEO. And we also have Fulvia Vargas-De Leon, Associate Counsel at LatinoJustice. Thank you, both of you, for joining us today.
Thank you for having us.
Great. So why don't we get started? If you can just introduce yourselves to the audience, tell us a little bit about your background and what you all are looking to do with the introduction of the voting rights bill. So we can get started with Fluvia, if you like.
Good evening, everyone. I am Fulvia Vargas-De Leon. As Raquel mentioned, I'm an associate counsel at LatinoJustice, and I've been in this role now for about a year and a half, really focusing on voting rights and redistricting work across our country. What brought me to this work, I am originally from Washington Heights, and I am passionate about my community. Prior to this, I worked in direct legal services, providing housing and employment law assistance to low-income New Yorkers. And really, what I wanted to do was create change. I think one of the things that direct legal services, at least in my experience, we know we can fix the issue, but we don't get to the heart of the problem, which is really changing the policies behind why so many New Yorkers are impacted by poor housing, inability to have wages that are livable wages in our city. So that's what brought me here to LatinoJustice. And really, when we talk about, as I mentioned, this is my role now, voting rights, and the John Lewis Voting Rights Act of New York. Our goal is really to empower our voters, our Latino voters, at a time where our country is just seeing a wave of voter suppression efforts across the country. I think New York is unique, but we are not oblivious to the issues that occur in terms of voter suppression because they have occurred in our state. So that's our goal, and I look forward to speaking a little bit further about the bill.
Thank you so much for that, Fluvia. And now I'll turn it over to Orlando Ovalles, who works at the National Association of Latino and Elected Officials fund, working towards making sure that our communities are at the table. Orlando, thank you so much for joining us today.
Good evening, Raquel. How are you? Good evening to all our viewers. Yes, I'm Orlando Valles, the Northeast Director of Civic Engagement for NALEO Educational Fun. NALEO is the National Association of Latino elected and appointed officials, as Raquel just mentioned. NALEO primary focus is to uplift the voices of Latinos communities in naturalization. We conduct workshops across the nation to make sure that Latinos and communities, minority groups, are pursuing citizenship, and that they are protected in terms of their voices. And we work really closely with voting protection, voting expansion, and we oversee redistricting. We are the watchdogs of redistricting across the board. And in my region, we watch redistricting in Pennsylvania, in New York, and New Jersey, and areas that are close to the Northeast. I'm Dominicano. I came to the United States when I was 12 years old and have done some work in a not for profit that no longer exists, but many people know, Alianza Dominicana. Then I went on to get my bachelor's in economics in Lehman College, and then a master's in finance as well. I've done some work in the New York Women's Chamber of Commerce, pursuing helping minority groups, women of color, and to get their certification, the MWB certification, which is the Minority or Women Business Enterprises. And after that, I started working as a chief of staff to formerly Assembly Member Carmen de la Rosa, who's now a council member for Council District 10. And last fall, I joined NALEO, as a Northeast director, I'm working to amplify the voices of Latinos through citizenship, through public service, and as the leading national organization that facilitates full Latino participation in the political process. I'm glad to be here. I'm glad to join your show, Raquel, Critica NYC, and I am happy to discuss further about the John Lewis New York Voting Rights Act alongside my colleague Fulvia.
Thank you so much for that. And it's so really great, I think, for us and for our audience who watch the Manhattan Neighborhood Network to know that we have this group of leaders, up and coming leaders like both of you, doing this real critical work. You know, I actually started in 2000 doing work around voting rights and census with my mentor Angelo Falcon and with Juan Cartagena before he was at LatinoJustice, when he was at CSS. And then most recently, fast forward last year, no, the year before, because now the years just all go into one another with this whole pandemic situation. I was in Georgia and I got to work with LatinoJustice to do electoral work on the elections, both the presidential election and the Georgia senatorial races, which was really important, right? And this is kind of what brings us to this moment. We know, right, today Texas is having elections, and SB1, which is their local law, the new law around voting rights, which creates barriers, right, especially to Latino and Black communities to be able to vote, where they have instituted several different processes and have taken even options away from people to be able to vote. So Fulvia, it would be great if you can just tell us a little bit about, you know, what is happening today, what did happen with the John Lewis Voting Rights Act at the national level, and then we can turn it to Orlando to talk about what we're looking to do here in New York.
Definitely, I can briefly talk about Texas. And Texas is an example because we see also Florida doing similar efforts through their SB 90 legislation. But basically, you know, as post the November 2020 elections, there was this narrative that was pushed that the reason why the election went the way it went was because of voter fraud, right? Because people were using absentee ballots, mail-in ballots, and so other methods that were, you know, usually not used during election to be able to cast a vote. What many forgot was that we were in the middle of a pandemic, and so people were making sure that they could exercise their right to vote in a manner that would protect their health at the same time. But instead of thinking about it that way, what occurred was that states such as Texas, with SB 1, passed laws that really restricted the manner in which you could cast your ballot. So they would not allow mail-in ballots. I believe under SB 1, any efforts to extend the times that polls are open. So that's a mechanism to allow, you know, individuals who have different work schedules, who don't work a 9 to 5, to be able to still cast a ballot. It's now illegal to be able to extend poll hours, which is incredibly insane and does prevent several groups from being able to exercise their right to vote. I believe in Texas also you could drive and drop off your ballot in a box. That was also done away with. So you would now, anybody who has physical incapacities and unable to get to a polling place and would drive can no longer do so. And one of the key things that I think is really scary for us as advocates in this field, and that we saw also in the SB 90 Florida legislation, is criminalizing doing any sort of voter education or voter engagement work that we do as nonprofits, meaning, you know, usually we go on election day, we respect the rules about where we stand, but we provide water and we answer questions about if any voter is confused about their poll site. And really the reason we do this is because for our communities in particular, right? For Spanish speakers, that sense of community is what keeps uh, Latino voters going out to vote, right? If we don't build that trust within our community, there's no way we can get them to the poll site. So that's efforts that we as Latino organizations have really done over the last couple decades to encourage our communities to go out there. Now what they've done is that they criminalize that behavior. So us being out and, handing out water, if it's hot in Texas, it's 101 degrees and they're voting, we can't hand out water bottles. That's criminalized. If, for example, NALEO, I know you may not do this, but if, for example, NALEO did a voter drive, right, and they collected voter registration forms, that can be criminalized. If they don't follow certain procedures, which can be as they missed and they didn't hand them in the next day, maybe 2 days afterwards to their local board of elections, NALEO could be penalized, and the people who were engaged in those efforts can be criminally penalized. So now we can't even get advocates or organizers on the ground as we're used to doing to make sure our communities go out to vote. So it really felt like an attack while they were saying, well, we're, protecting the integrity of our electoral system. We really care about election protection work and we're against voter fraud. It really felt like at a time where Latinos are coming to vote, out to vote, right? Where we are now a large section of our population based on the census. It really felt like an attack on this growing electorate. I feel like they felt threatened, and what they did in response was ensure that all those efforts that they know that as advocates we engage with, they are now criminalized. So we kind of are forced to get really creative on how we're going to be able to educate and get our community to be able to vote. I know you asked about the John Lewis Act. On the federal level, we know that there was a huge push also post 2020 and after Congressman Lewis passed away to get this legislation passed, which would provide greater voter protection that since the Voting Rights Act has been just cut out by the courts. And there was a huge push for it, and there was a lot of advocacy around it. And we heard initially presidential candidates even talking about the need for voter protection work and legislation at the federal level, because we have lost so much of it since 1965. And it's insane to say that out loud, but we have. But it's kind of been radio silence in the last couple months. We hoped that the president would make some sort of outward statement, and maybe the State of the Union address will mention it, although we don't think it will, that we don't think that's now a priority of the federal government as it was a few months back. But it's still something we're really pushing forward. And if not on the federal level, as Orlando will speak, we'll definitely push for it at the state level.
Fulvia, no, thank you so much for that. And I think, look, we know, right? This is an attack. This is an attack on our communities, and the fact that communities like the Latino community has a growing electorate, is going to the polls more and more. And Orlando, you may discuss it later, but I know that NALEO, right, put out a report recently talking about the rise of Latinos in Arizona, Nevada, and Colorado, and their and that growing electorate and what that means. And and while we can have a whole long conversation around what are the policies that matter to Latinos, and everything from immigration to abortion issues or what have you, the economy, work, and all of those things, right? At the end of the day, for a lot of us, the most essential thing is making sure that we can get to the polls, that we can cast our vote, and that we are actually a part of the process. So, Orlando, I'll turn it over to you to talk more about the efforts on improving voter protection in New York.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you, Raquel. Yes, we are all aware of the failure at the congressional failure of the John Lewis Voting Rights Act, the Advancement Act, which is the federal one, that has not materialized. There has been some there has been some barriers, some roadblocks that the legislature at the federal level has not been able to fulfill. And in essence, we are anticipating that the president will speak to that to some degree, because we understand that right now there's a war with Russia and Ukraine, and we actually anticipate that he's gonna be focusing on that more so than voting rights. But we do want to make sure, and I'm sure that our organizations alike, like Latino Justice, my colleague Fulvia, we are anticipating that the president would take a leading voice and firm action into um, uh, ensuring that people know that this voter suppression is actually something that is happening all across the board, and it starts in Texas, then it trickles down to Florida, and it continues, like, it spreads like a cancer. Here in New York, as a state that welcomes immigrants, that sanctuary, um, the the legislature wants to make sure that we have a leading voice in ensuring that those protections are enacted, because voting is the one thing that you, as a voter, when you vote and you deposit that ballot, when you go to your poll site, that's an expression of trust. That's an expression of you believing in a candidate that you're voting for. So we are a firm believer that democracy at its core has to be intentional, has to be inclusive, has to be accessible to voters, to minority groups, in this case Latino groups, and others that are has been affected by this disenfranchisement of this of voting in general, and also people that have historically been marginalized from the voting process. And we want to make sure that in New York we are taking the leap of faith, and that we are setting the example across the nation. And Fulvia is going to speak to the legality of this legislation, and the impact, but just making sure that our democracy is protected, that our people are actually voting, that they understand that their vote matters, and that there's no efforts to suppress their vote, their voices, and that they could access voting through voting by mail, early voting, and the different ways of voting that we have had and experienced because of the pandemic. The pandemic, we had states that had curbside voting, that had 24-hour voting, and we want to make sure that that stays consistent, that stays that stays permanent, and it's perpetual. So it is something that we are really thinking about. We're being critical. We're being observing, and making sure that we are helping other organizations to amplify those voices, and that also we feel that the Voting Rights Act in New York has been very affiliated to the to the to the Black History movement, the Black History movement, when it comes to voting suppression that happened in the '60s, and we want to make sure that Latinos understand that at this across the state, but also that we are instrumental in engaging Latino voices in that effort. So
Yeah, no, and Orlando, I think that, we are living in a very interesting moment in terms of history, right? It's really not that long ago that the African American community and Latino communities and the Asian community worked so hard, one, to be able to be recognized, right, as citizens of the United States, but then being able to get the Voting Rights Act in the 60s. And then you fast forward to now, and we see that a lot of the leaders that were at the forefront at that moment are passing, right, retiring, or whatever. The baton has been passed to new leaders. We had our first Black president in the United States with Barack Obama. And then, now it's like this backlash, right, around all the work that has come to this moment, to now, having the Voting Rights Act basically gutted. And I don't want to say we're back at the drawing board, but have to now, go back kind of to make sure that we ensure that what we have, we keep, and that also does not get gutted, all in the name of security, right, and law and order. And, so much has been shown to say that there has been no fraud. I mean, we saw in the state of Georgia, the person in charge of the Board of Elections stated that there was no fraud, that the election was conducted fairly and justly. But this issue continues coming up and driving, right, all of these policies that we're seeing. So how do we make sure that that doesn't kind of get to us here in New York? Fulvia, you want to address that?
I mean, this is where the legislation, the John Lewis Voting Rights Act of New York, really comes in. I always like to say we are proud New Yorkers, and we pride ourselves with being progressive in sort of a lot of our legislation. But New York is not, I guess it hasn't experienced very much the same things that occurred in Georgia. We did have voter suppression efforts, back when we had Puerto Rican voters in the city, right? What we as in New York officials would do was that they would have sort of a literacy test that would prevent them from registering to vote. The voter registration was only in English, so if you did not speak English, you could not register to vote. They were eligible. Puerto Rican individuals are eligible to vote in New York State elections, and so it made no sense, right, that they would purposely have a mechanism that would exclude them from voting. But we did that. We also, in 2016 in Brooklyn, did away with thousands, and I mean thousands, of what they call inactive voters. And those inactive voters, I think about 15% of them were Latino or individuals with Latino sounding last names. I like to think people make mistakes, but these coincidences only always target certain groups in our communities. And so the effort to pass this bill is really just a step in ensuring that we don't go back. We don't roll back the clock on a lot of the things, a lot of the progress we've made, at least on the state level, but definitely that we don't succumb to sort of the voter suppression efforts that are now rampant across our country. So just to briefly speak on some of the highlights. The bill is long, so I won't go too far, but one of the key things that I really appreciate about this bill, it's being intentional, as Orlando said, about our community. And one of the ways it does so is through language access for non-English speakers. So one of the things that in New York City we may not feel is that oftentimes when a voter who's non-English speaking tries to exercise their right to vote, they are met with either ballots that are in English only or poll sites that do not have poll workers who can assist them with the instructions on how to cast their ballot. These are immediate barriers because there is nothing that is more frustrating for someone than when they can't understand what exactly they're doing or how to navigate a system. Not that New York City is also not familiar with these issues because it does occur in every election, but this bill will lower the threshold. So the Federal Voting Rights Act requires either 10,000 individuals or 5% of the citizens of voting age to be limited English proficient and speak a particular language before an election district is required to provide any sort of language assistance. Let it be materials, poll workers, ballots. So New York City, for the most part, at least Spanish speakers are covered. The John Lewis bill, however, will change that threshold and will lower it to just 2% or 4,000 individuals within that election district. And I know 4,000 sounds like a lot, but when we think about places outside of New York where Spanish speakers have moved to upstate New York, We think about Syracuse, Buffalo. This is going to be key because these are areas where traditionally, if you do not speak English, you cannot exercise your right to vote. And so we think this is a step forward where at least we start building that community, that effort to just ensure that people who are non-English speakers or limited English speakers are not completely turned away because of their language. So this is a crucial, I think, step to ensuring that our community is able to exercise their vote, and definitely outside of New York City, which I know tends to be the focus oftentimes, and we forget the rest of the state. And I can go on to the rest.
Yeah, no, I think that is, I mean, that's a wonderful start, right? Because we know in New York City, there has been massive efforts to make sure that there is access in languages so that people are able to participate in voting, right? And everything from like Russian to like the various languages that are spoken, even Chinese, you have Mandarin, you have Simple, there's so many different dialects. And New York City has really made a lot of efforts. There's still a lot to do. There's still a lot more to go. But to be able to see these efforts happen in other parts of New York State where our populations are growing by leaps and bounds, right? You have Long Island. Long Island has its own set of issues, right? Upstate, places closer to the Canadian border, right? You have other growing communities, like you have a lot of Afghan refugees arriving, and eventually, right, that would also be an issue. So, I do see the importance of not only having that, but having the resources, having the interpreters and the information available, and all of those things just really become just so much more important in this. But it would be also great to, speak a little bit more about where we are in the process. I understand that we have sponsors in the Assembly. Walker is sponsoring, and Myri, I know I'm mispronouncing his name in the Senate. If you all want to talk
Selma
about that.
Marie. Selma Marie. Yes, he's actually the election committee chair and a senator of Brooklyn, and he's the sponsor in the Senate. But right now we are working to make sure that there's more co-sponsorships in the Assembly, because we believe that it's going to pass in the Senate. So they need help with the lower house and then in your state assembly, so that the bill could actually pass. As in the New York State Assembly, it needs at least over 70 co-sponsorships to pass, and that's what we're here to make sure that people understand that they could put some pressure on their local representatives, and they could call the assembly switchboard, which I'm going to share the phone number now, so that people could call the representatives and make sure that they co-sponsor this legislation. So 518-455-4100, and they could tweet about it. They could send an email. If you go to the New York Assembly .gov website, you could see your representatives, their district office address, and their phone numbers. And we want to make sure that this leads to a call to action to our viewers, that they are taking they're taking the opportunity to call their representatives and let them know that this is important, that this issue is important to their communities and for future generations to come.
And so, which Latino or Latina electeds have signed on already in the Assembly? Have any of them signed yet?
There is a list that I do not currently have handy, but there are a list. But one of the key aspects is we know we have a large amount or new, I guess, group of Latino electorates in the Bronx. And so the Bronx is one of the areas where we've had the least support for the bill. It's probably because a lot of them are new, but we definitely encourage our Latino representatives in the Bronx to engage with the bill, to reach out if they have questions about the bill, because it's really important to demonstrate just support for something that's going to really impact a lot of us in New York City, but across the state as well.
Sure. Look, I think that as the efforts, right? Oh, we have Catalina Cruz and Kenny Burgos have both signed on. Thank you so much for that, Juan, for posting
Thank you,
that.
Juan.
Yeah, that's really great. So, and Kenny Burgos is from the Bronx, and Catalina Cruz is from Queens, and one of the most diverse districts in all of New York State and in the country, basically. And I think that it is important that we really continue having this conversation and engaging with our elected officials to assure that we are protecting our voting rights and expanding them here in New York State. Right, most recently last year, and it went into effect at the beginning of this year in New York City. Legal permanent residents and those with certain documents are going to be able to vote in New York City elections. And while there is a case pending that the Republicans are challenging this piece of legislation, so we shall wait and see. But New York has been, and New York City has been very progressive when it has come to this issue of assuring people are able to participate, are able to cast their votes, and really be a part of the process. I mean, what else could we be doing to assure that something, we're doing this for New York, right? And Fulvia, like you had mentioned, right, New York generally has been progressive, right, compared to other states, but it doesn't mean that we're completely safe, right, from having more conservative sort of policies come through our state and win. What else could we be doing at the federal level to continue the pressure up? I think, right, when we're talking about Latino communities, we're also talking about immigrant communities, women, LGBTQ. How do we assure, right, that our neighborhoods, our issues are being addressed, they're being brought to the table, right? Because here we're talking about specifically making sure that a vote is cast, but then there's all these other barriers that always come up, right? Everything from like who can even come out and run for a position, right? Because even running is hard and has its challenges. And New York has been really, New York City in particular, because of things like campaign finance, helps more people to run and to be a part of the democratic process. What can we do to make sure that a bill like the John Lewis Voting Rights Act at the federal level passes? What else could we be doing?
I think one of the key things here, and it's incredibly frustrating, is that we see more efforts by the state than the federal government in taking any sort of action on this bill. And what I remind people is that they'll say, okay, well, how is it going to really make a difference? But right now at the federal level with voting rights, it's like we have all the doors are shutting for us, it feels like, because our courts right now are very reluctant to sort of expand voting rights or to even deal with voting rights. In fact, if you look at the history of voting rights cases over the last couple years, judges have just done away with voting rights, just chipped at it little by little. And so we have no support from the courts, no support from the federal government. And I think it's really a push to educate our communities and demonstrate to them why this is so important. What is at stake here, right? Because you said we don't want to roll back to 1965, but it feels like slowly that's where we're going to when all these doors are shutting for us to be able to have a point of advocacy. I always say put pressure on your elected officials. Like, you put them into office, they're supposed to work for you. And this extends not just for voting rights, but any issue that you're facing in your community. Put the pressure on because they are there to serve you and they are supposed to be responsive to your needs. So I really think we need to do more about making sure our elected officials are responsive to our needs and do not shut us out from being able to have a voice. Because we definitely don't have them right now at the courts, and the least we can do is hold our elected officials responsible.
Orlando?
And to Fulvia's point, I would say also we have to do a concerted effort to tackle misinformation, Misinformation has been something that has been affecting minority groups, Latino communities, the access to information. Not a lot of our voters, or the average voter, has access to a computer, has access to the internet, has access to information. And likewise, the vaccine hesitancy, there's been a lot of misinformation spread around the country about voting rights, and that voting by mail is fraud and things of that nature. So we have to acknowledge that that's actually something that's affecting communities, especially in people that are part of of the voting bloc, and we need to ensure that there's more there's more promotion of having communities taking their having communities voting, but also educating. The education component is vital to ensure that there's participation, that there is robust participation from groups of interest, because we all know that there's misinformation all over the social media, whether it's WhatsApp, Facebook, and there are and that misinformation, um, unfortunately, has an impact in our communities. And if it doesn't go in hand with with the education component, we believe that there will be some people that will not turn out to vote in this primary election and the general election coming up in November.
Yeah, no, I would have to agree with you on this issue of information. And, I also wonder, like, what can we be doing to really hold campaigns accountable here, right? Because campaigns are really what drives this information. And when you see, these political ads that are just, propaganda, right? Because a lot of what I saw and I witnessed in Georgia in particular, I was just floored at the information that was being put out there. And I think that, right, the more you put it out there, the more eventually people are just going to say, yeah, you're right. That's exactly what is happening. And so, what could we do, along those lines? Even, and not just, right, there's the education piece, but there is this, what people really pay attention to at the end of the day is the campaigns. I mean, what are we looking at in terms of, like, just even overall campaign reform?
I think really that's a great point, and it's a place we should start. I mean, we criminalize up. I mean, our advocacy efforts are being criminalized to encourage people to vote. I wish the same would be done about misinformation, because they are detrimental to our community. Um, it's unfortunate that someone can put an ad on TV with no sort of facts and just put it out there, and if they have enough money, they can send these messages to our communities. But there's no sort of they're not penalized in any sort of way except that they garner enough people who are then reluctant to get vaccinated or to go out to vote or just believe all this misinformation, as Orlando mentioned. So I definitely think that even as advocates, while we're fighting for voter rights reform, that we should be considering how campaigns affect some of those efforts as well.
Orlando? Oh, you're on mute, I think, Orlando.
Oh, I apologize.
It's okay.
We NALEO Educational Fund. We just recently released our projections for the Latino vote, and we projected 11.6 million Latinos will be turning out to vote. And we are that's just a floor projection, and we are actually asking campaigns to make more efforts to engage the Latino community in their language. And we do believe that not all Latinos speak Spanish, but
Mhm.
we are all aware that there has to be some investments in Latino communities, from campaigns, from CBOs, community-based organizations, and to make them an integral part of of participating in our democracy. So when we see efforts, when we see financial investments, real substantial tangible investments in the Latino communities, especially, and minority groups alike, we see more turnout. We see more people coming out. We see more people being vibrant about voting, and that's the energy that we want. It's not only for the presidential; the local elections are just as important. And I say this to people whenever I speak to young voters, or somebody that actually looks up to me as a mentor. I'll tell them, what are the odds that you're going to see a president, and that you're going to be able to walk into the office of a president or a governor, to say the least. But you could actually see your council member. You could go and visit your assembly member. You could visit your senator. So those are the people that you have to hold more accountable than the actual president. They're both equally important, but to say that local politics matter, local governance matters. It impacts your life somewhere or another. It impacts your livelihood. It impacts your children, your family. And that's the same thing with the census. We did a lot of census work last year, and there was a lot of misinformation around the census. We know that there was the adequate funding wasn't there for the census, in across the board, federal, state, somewhat in the city. But we want to make sure that if we are talking the talk, we're also walking the walk when it comes to investments of minority groups to actually take participate in our democracy.
Yeah, Orlando, and thank you for bringing up that topic of redistricting. If we could just discuss that just briefly, right? Because that is something that really directly impacts how representation looks in our barrios, right? And we just wrapped up the federal redistricting and the level redistricting for the Assembly and the Senate. Soon, redistricting will start for the localities like New York City Council. I would love to hear from both of you, right? What are our lessons learned in this last round that we've had after the 2020 census?
You have to keep the process transparent. If you're going to say you're going to do it, you got to hold yourself to it. One of the, I think, as advocates that we discussed was, they held so many hearings, the IRC held so many hearings, and we were really inspired by that, because redistricting is usually a process that's conducted among elected officials, backdoor conversations. We just don't hear about how these districts are drawn. We just see the maps. And so we were really motivated by the amount of people that came out to these hearings. Some of them lasted for hours upon hours. And it was great to see the community just be so engaged with a process that they have never been a part of traditionally. And then to see the process just like flip a switch and go back to sort of those same backdoor conversations where we didn't know how these maps are ultimately drawn, it was incredibly frustrating. So for us, definitely want to highlight, at least for the city process, to keep the process transparent, engage the community, ask them how does their community look like? What are some of the community markers that are important to that district? What are the boundaries of that district? It doesn't all make sense on the map sometimes, but really speaking and hearing from community members, you're so much better informed about where that community exists. And so that's one of the, I think, lessons learned from this state process and this federal process, was just going from a process that we thought was going to be transparent to just really going back to the same way that the previous cycle was, in terms of engaging the community.
Orlando?
Yes, echoing what Fulvia just mentioned, redistricting is a process that happens post census. It's after the decennial census, and it actually drawing the lines in a way that is consistent with what the numbers show in the census. And we want to make sure that the process is as independent as possible, that the process is equitable, that is transparent, that is accessible to communities of color, that is accessible to minority groups, minority languages, and that people could provide a testimony without having any barriers, and that they could actually talk about the lines and what the communities of interest is going to look like, and that is culturally competent. We provided testimonies to the IRC, to the Independent Redistricting Commission, talking mostly focused on the actual process, that when somebody signs up to provide a testimony, that there's provisions in Spanish so that the person can actually sign up, and that language accessibility is not an accommodation, but it's actually an access. because it is not a disability to speak Spanish. So we want to make sure that the process is actually transparent, like Fulvia mentioned, but it's also accessible to anybody, to any resident of a particular district, and that of
Thank
course that is as independent as possible, which is why we want representation in this commission in the locality, the one for New York City. That's actually the mayor is due to release his appointments March 7th. We want to make sure that his appointments are reflect New York City, that it reflects we have in New York City, we have over 20% Latinos, and we have a lot of registered voters that are Latinos. We have um, 3.5, 3.9 million voters, and out of those, there's almost a million voters that are registered Latinos. So we want to make sure that the appointments reflect that.
Thank you for that, Orlando. So we have a few more minutes. I just want to give each of you just like 30 seconds to wrap up. Is there anything else that you want to make sure that gets said, and making sure that our viewers are aware on what's happening at the state level, that they continue being involved, that they come out to vote, that they participate in their community boards, in these hearings, and all the things. Fluvia, I turn it over to you.
Definitely in 30 seconds. First of all, the budget is getting passed April 1st. So a lot of these election reforms is really crucial that we, put our foot to the pedal and really try to get a lot of these reforms passed, because we need actual funds to be able to engage in this work and be able to educate our community if this legislation is passed. Two, again, as the city redistricting process does start, any way that you think you can get involved with, we're definitely going to engage in some efforts to educate our community, to make it accessible. As Orlando said, we definitely want to hear from community members. And lastly, Raquel briefly mentioned Introduction 1867, which is municipal voting rights for green card holders and those with work authorization. Do know those efforts are starting soon. The Board of Elections is engaging in developing materials, but you're not eligible to vote till the 2023 elections. So this year will just be education and registration, and the actual ability to vote will not start till 2023. So just to clarify, because I know that sort of will start getting confusing as the year progresses.
Thank you so much for that, Fluvia. And we have reached our end. Thank you, Orlando. Please, everyone, make sure to tune in to Critica NYC. Our next show will be on Tuesday, March 15th. Thank you so much, Fluvia. Thank you so much, Orlando, for all of your work, all of your efforts, your leadership. Please keep up the wonderful work. And we are here to help support in any way that we can. Thank you so much, everyone, and have a good night.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you, Raquel. Thank you.